In the swamps west of Miami, in the early 1990s, 80% of Florida panther males born between 1990 and 1992 entered the world with a single testicle or none at all. That is not a metaphor for decline. That is the clinical finding that a veterinarian named Melody Roque documented across an entire surviving population of a species. The males had defective sperm. The females had small holes in their hearts that produced audible murmurs. A strange counterclockwise whirl of fur, called a cowlick, appeared on 94% of the population, compared to 9% in healthy puma groups anywhere else on the continent. These were not isolated individuals. This was the whole species. Every living Florida panther carried every one of these defects at once. By the end of this video, you will understand how a single, irreversible genetic experiment performed in a Florida swamp became the template for saving a species from biological self-destruction, and why a study published in July of 2025 revealed that the rescue may have quietly introduced a second crisis no one saw coming. In January of 1995, a 58-year-old Texas cougar hunter named Roy McBride was handed an order with no precedent in the history of conservation biology. Capture 8 female mountain lions in West Texas, put them on planes, fly them to Florida, release them into the wild, and let them breed with the dying males. The scientists who approved the plan gave it a 95% chance of being the last meaningful intervention. What they did not give it was a reversal option. Once those cats were released, the genetics of the Florida panther were permanently altered. There was no second vote. The official story, the one taught in conservation biology programs, cited in wildlife management textbooks, and repeated in environmental journalism, is that the experiment worked. The population tripled. The defects disappeared. In 2017, a panther crossed north of the Caloosahatchee River with kittens for the first time in over 40 years, and the scientific consensus declared a historic success. The 2010 paper in the journal Science confirmed it. The numbers were unambiguous. But in July of 2025, a team of researchers at UCLA and UC Berkeley published a genomic analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looked at the same rescue from a level of genetic resolution no one had applied before. What they found was not what anyone expected. In the early 1990s, in the swamps west of Miami, fewer than 30 wild panthers remained on Earth, and they were dying in ways that defied normal extinction. Not from habitat loss alone, not from disease moving through a crowded population. The Florida panther was collapsing from within, their tails kinked at unnatural angles near the base. Their sperm counts had fallen so far that reproductive biologists struggled to categorize what they were examining. A 1992 population viability analysis, the kind of mathematical modeling that wildlife agencies commission when they need a definitive verdict, delivered its finding with clinical precision, 95% probability of total extinction within 2 decades. Not decline, not endangerment. Extinction with a timeline and a confidence interval. What made the situation extraordinary was not the number. It was what the number meant. 20 years is not geological time. 20 years is 2 generations of wildlife managers. 20 years is a career. Someone who had just started working for Florida Fish and Wildlife in 1992 would still be at their desk when the last panther died. Before we track the radical, irreversible genetic experiment this translocation unleashed in the Everglades, we need to baseline our own map. Drop a comment right now with the state or region you are watching from, and let us know if your local wildlife systems are currently facing an unmanageable ecological or land development crisis. Subscribing to this channel ensures you stay pinned to the data as we expose the hidden metrics the mainstream continues to ignore. Now back to the swamp, because the population had just hit an absolute brick wall. What she actually documented was a biological emergency in slow motion. The population had hit an absolute brick wall. Melody Roque was a veterinarian, not an alarmist. She had been hired to monitor a small population under stress. What she found instead, across years of field examinations in the sawgrass and cypress of South Florida was something that did not behave like ordinary wildlife decline. The defects she catalogued were not random. They were systematic, generational. Every examination confirmed the previous one, and every generation of kittens arrived carrying the accumulated damage of the one before it. Inbreeding had not simply reduced the panther's genetic diversity. It had compressed it into a corridor so narrow that the species was essentially running the same broken code over and over again in every body with every birth. When Rolke shipped tissue samples to Stephen O'Brien at the National Institutes of Health in Maryland, she was looking for confirmation. O'Brien was one of the foremost mammalian geneticists in the world. What his analysis returned was not reassuring. The Florida panther possessed less measurable genetic variation than almost any large mammal his laboratory had ever processed. Not less than most. Less than almost any. 6 reproductive females remained. 6 animals carried the entire genetic future of the subspecies. That is not a population. That is a last will and testament. In October of 1992, the people responsible for that future gathered at White Oak Plantation in Georgia for an emergency summit that was, by most accounts, more argument than agreement. The proposal on the table: fly Texas mountain lions into Florida and allow them to breed with the surviving panthers, was immediately and forcefully opposed by a faction of conservation biologists who believed the cure was worse than the disease. Their position was not irrational. If the Texas cats outcompeted or genetically overwhelmed the Florida population, the subspecies would survive in name only. What walked out of the Everglades would be a Texas cougar with Florida paperwork. They called it genetic swamping, and they were not wrong to fear it. The federal budget provided no resolution. Government funding for the translocation stalled completely, and the window for intervention was narrowing. A private conservation organization ultimately stepped in to cover the operational costs of the capture flights. The rescue of a species came down to a grant that a government couldn't approve in time. Tracking these multi-layered genetic and institutional standoffs requires an audience that values hard, empirical data over simple emotional storytelling. If you demand this level of investigative ground truth, take a second to hit the subscribe button and join our independent research collective. Now, look closely at the January 1995 logistics ledger, because the state finally gave a 58-year-old lion hunter the green light. By the time the experiment had been running for 3 years, the wildlife biologists tracking the telemetry signatures began seeing data that surprised even the scientists who had pushed hardest for the plan. But first, the experiment nearly ended before it produced a single kitten. 3 of the 8 Texas females died within the first years of release. 1 struck by a vehicle on a Florida highway, 1 shot illegally, 1 dead from causes that underscored exactly how fragile the margin was. The most ambitious genetic rescue in North American conservation history had been reduced, through bad luck and human negligence, to 5 surviving cats. 5 animals now carried the entire weight of the hypothesis. Those 5 mated, and what the biologists found in the kittens changed the scientific conversation permanently. No heart murmurs. The holes in the hearts were gone. The testicle defects that had plagued 80% of purebred males did not appear in the hybrids. The cowlick frequency dropped. The sperm counts recovered. According to the 2010 analysis published in the journal Science, average genetic heterozygosity climbed from 16% to 24% across the population. Purebred panther kittens had survived at a rate of 21%. Hybrid kittens survived at 53%. The population crossed 100 animals, then kept climbing. In 2017, a female panther with kittens crossed north of the Caloosahatchee River, a geographic threshold no panther had reached in over 40 years. The experiment had not just worked. It had worked beyond the parameters its designers had modeled. The conservation establishment declared the case closed. It was not closed. In July of 2025, a team of researchers from UCLA and UC Berkeley published a new analysis that completely shattered the comfort of this conservation story. introducing a hidden genetic time bomb that wildlife managers completely failed to account for. The study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, began by confirming what everyone already believed. The original Florida panther ancestry had been preserved. Between 59 and 80% of the modern population's genome traced directly back to the original Florida lineage, not erased, not swamped, not replaced. The conservationists who had feared genetic annihilation in 1992 were wrong. The subspecies had survived the rescue intact. And then the researchers looked deeper. What the standard heterozygosity measurements had never captured, what 3 decades of population monitoring had never detected, were the recessive mutations riding silently inside the Texas genome. Hidden, unexpressed, biologically invisible at the population's sizes the panther had reached. The UCLA and UC Berkeley team ran simulation models against the full genomic dataset and found something that should have stopped the celebration entirely. Mutations introduced by the Texas translocation now account for approximately half of all harmful genetic variants currently circulating in the Florida panther population. Not a fraction, not a footnote. Half. The defects did not disappear, they went underground. And the simulations revealed exactly when they would resurface. If the population remains small and isolated, held near the 200 animal threshold that managers currently consider conservation success, the inbreeding coefficient will eventually climb high enough to force those recessive mutations into expression. The kinked tails, the heart defects, the sterility, the biological emergency that the translocation appeared to solve was not solved. It was deferred with interest. This hidden biological gridlock is clashing directly with massive corporate land development. For those of you watching from expanding subtropical or rural zones, especially across the American South or Southwest, let us know in the comments if you've seen localized wildlife corridors get completely paved over by corporate construction projects. Your field reports keep our independent mapping accurate. Now, look at the final invoice for this ongoing survival battle. And the Panthers face a more immediate crisis that has nothing to do with genetics, because genetic rescue is not a permanent fix. It buys time. It does not buy a future. In 2024, 36 Florida Panthers were killed by vehicle strikes, near record, on the same roads that killed 3 of Roy McBride's 8 Texas cats in the years after their release. The road network has not shrunk, it has expanded. And directly adjacent to the core panther habitat, a development project proposing 10,000 new homes is moving through the approval process. Not in the panther's historic range, not on its periphery, but inside the corridor the species requires to grow beyond the population threshold at which the hidden mutations will eventually resurface. Think about what the full shape of this looks like. Fewer than 30 animals, a biological emergency too severe to ignore, an irreversible intervention with no reversal option. A 30-year verdict of success. And then, at the molecular level, the discovery that the rescue introduced a second emergency running quietly beneath the first, waiting for the population to shrink back toward the size that will force it into expression. The question is no longer whether the Florida panther was saved. The question is whether what we call saving a species is something we actually know how to do, or whether we are, at best, rescheduling a catastrophe we don't yet have the political will to prevent permanently. What is the true value of a species if we spend millions to patch its genetic code while ignoring the physical roads destroying its habitat? Drop your ultimate thoughts below alongside your location, and if this investigation permanently changes how you look at ecological data, subscribe to Earth Discovery Series. Whether that rescue holds, or whether the panther slides back toward the edge, depends on what happens in the next 20 years, not the next 200 years. Because every apex predator we pull back from zero requires a messy, expensive, and deeply political combination of human effort. If you think an experiment involving 26 panthers and 5 Texas Cougars in a Florida swamp was a dangerous gamble, you haven't seen what happened when the federal government tried to put a vanished apex predator back into the forests of North Carolina. In 1980, the United States government declared the red wolf completely extinct in the wild, officially wiped off the map. The entire genetic future of the species came down to just 14 pure survivors locked in a chain-link enclosure in Washington state. When biologists released 4 breeding pairs into the coastal swamps of North Carolina, they inadvertently kicked off the longest-running, most legally tangled, and most fiercely contested wildlife battle in American history. A 30-year experiment that soared to over 120 wild wolves crashed down to a catastrophic grand total of just 7 remaining animals, and then, against all scientific odds, staged a shocking, top-secret modern comeback. If you want to see the exact playbook that built the template for modern conservation and the brutal human warfare that nearly destroyed it twice, subscribe to this channel and click the video on your screen right now. Let's go across the country to North Carolina to see what 30 years in an empty forest actually did. The Florida panther still exists, but it exists the way a patient exists after emergency surgery, alive, watched, and entirely dependent on decisions being made in rooms it will never enter.